Well, good evening. Welcome to the Center Online. I'm Carolyn Merrick, Program Coordinator here at the Center, and we are here for our third installment of our speaker series, Indigenous Americans, We're Still Here. Tonight we have Equity Specialist Lars Holmstrom, who will be talking about, well, the title of his talk is In Local Schools, Efforts to Recenter Indigenous American Identities and Lenses. Again, I'm Carolyn, I'll be your host tonight, and some of the meeting particulars, everyone is coming in muted, and if you have any questions or comments for Lars at all, anytime during the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat. When Lars has finished his presentation, the talking part, we'll have time for Q&A, and I'll do my best to get to as many questions as we can at that time. This program is being recorded and it'll be uploaded to our YouTube channel, where we have all of our other speaker series, as well as the first two installments. And if you've registered for this, obviously you have, I will send you the link to that in an email when we upload it. If you would be so kind as to please stay until the end, we have a brief 5-question survey that it's really helpful for you to fill out for us so that we get a really good idea of what our programming means to you and how we can shape and grow our program in the future. So I will turn it over now to our Executive Director, Peter Thompson.
Thank you, Carolyn, for all your work on behalf of the Center. And thank you, everyone, for joining us, and welcome. I am Peter Thompson. I have the great pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of the Center. Our mission is to provide what research proves are the keys to healthy aging: physical, intellectual, social wellness programs. Lifelong learning is a key component of that, giving people information, both learning for the sake of learning and to help you navigate a more wellness. We have several other values: diversity and inclusion, excellence, sustainability, and community impact. Aligned with these missions and mission and values, we're pleased to provide this Building a More Inclusive Community speaker series. I'm particularly mindful as the civil trial versus the organizers of the August 2017 rally takes place in our community of the long-standing wounds in our community and in our country. The Center sees a role we can play. Excuse me, my internet's a little unstable. Hopefully I'm coming through. The Center sees a role in playing in helping us to build bridges, which our community and our country needs. And while tonight is free and open to all, because volunteers lead this effort and our speakers are doing this pro bono, there are expenses to providing such program. If you support the Center, thank you very much for that. If you support this type of programming, but not yet part of our vital philanthropic family, please consider a donation. 60% of our budget every year comes from friends like you. I believe Carolyn will put a chat in to learn more about the Center, as well as how to make a donation online. You can always write a check and drop it off or bring it in the mail as well. Because these programs, I know centuries of history cannot be absolved with just a single speaker series, but it is a part, we hope and we trust, in building a healthier and more inclusive community for all. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend Mike Wilson, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Mike.
Hi, my name is Mike Wilson. I'm part of the subcommittee from the Center that worked on putting together the speaker series. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. And here it is. For thousands of years, the people of the Monacan Nation have lived on, protected, and cultivated the lands on which Charlottesville and the University of Virginia stand. These spaces were built on colonized, unceded lands by many enslaved laborers. As ancient people who thrive today, we acknowledge and respect the Monacan stewardship of the land, past, present, and future. Thank you. Tonight's speaker is Lars Holmstrom. He's from Albemarle County Public Schools. He's an equity specialist, and he's going to be taking a look at sharing how the school division has been working to build partnerships and take action to recenter Indigenous American identities and perspectives, including but not limited to those of the 7 federally recognized tribes of Virginia. He will share the journey from recognizing areas of growth within the school system through the paths of partnering and establishing clear actions, and on to stories of surprise and hope from along the journey. One other point, I'd like to remind people that we will not be having a session next Wednesday, but it'll be in 2 weeks on December 1st. And it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend Lars Holmstrom.
Thanks so much, Mike. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Carolyn, as well. Let me see if I can share my screen here so we can go ahead and get started. Okay. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Great. All right. Well, Carolyn and Mike both introduced this title, Recentering Indigenous American Identities and Lenses in Our School. And I guess I want to start right off the bat by just saying a word about the title. You know, I do prefer to use whatever terms when I'm referring to people that people would use for themselves. You know, if I'm in conversation with people, I prefer to defer to them if they use the term Native or Native American or Indian or Indigenous. And so I mention that just because in a general audience, I'll use a number of different terms. And that's a limitation of the language. The language here is a bit of a placeholder, and it comes with its own baggage. But I do hope that we'll do something together this evening that will make good on our attentions to go beyond the limitations of that language. And Mike made a beautiful land acknowledgement here. And I wasn't sure if you would do that, Mike. I heard you do that on the first session, and I appreciate that. You know, in that first session, Dr. Jernigan noted that a land acknowledgement without restorative action can be I think she said it can be like a sort of a taunt, you know, kind of an empty promise. So I'm hopeful that we can share some of the work that we've been beginning to do. We're just at the beginning of the path in Albemarle County Public Schools, so taking some of those restorative actions and moving forward in partnership with the Monacan Nation and holding ourselves in that place of respect for both the land and the Monacan people, past and present. That's important to me. That's a matter of integrity, I think. I think that this is probably also the right time to say thanks to the many collaborators that have helped me put this session together. I'll share work that I'm involved with, but certainly not work that I've accomplished by myself at all. This work is that I'll share today and discuss is the work of many, many people coming together. Some of them are here in this session today. Lots of people have contributed, so I want to thank them for all their work and all their efforts and continued efforts. So thanks to my colleagues, thanks to my Virginia Indian partners and friends, and my family as well for all of their support. Okay, and so all of that without an introduction for myself either. I'll say a few words about what I do and what this equity specialist job is. So my name is Lars Holmstrom, and I am an equity specialist with Albemarle County Public Schools. And when I have to explain what that means plainly, like when I'm just what my kids say, is that it's my job to make sure that school is fair for everybody. That's the plain language version, you know. And the fancy way of saying it is that I'm on a team of people that looks for what we call predictive correlations between social and cultural factors and student outcomes. And that's a mouthful. But what it means is that we look to see when students and families are experiencing positive or negative outcomes, when they're having a more or less successful experience at school, if there are patterns behind that. And then we work to understand the cultural, the racial, the social landscape that produces those patterns, and then partner with teachers, certainly, but also with whole schools, with building administrators, with county administrators to understand what's behind that and what we need to do to break up those patterns and solve those problems where they exist. So I work out of the Office of Community Engagement. I work in close partnership with the Office of Instruction, supporting teachers and classroom instructions directly. It's my 5th year on this job, and each year we've added a team member. So right now I'm on a team of 6 people that serves all of the schools and the county administration for Albemarle County Public Schools. So it's that perspective largely that I'm bringing you here today. And I am an educator at heart. This is my 18th year, I think, in education. So I always like to put the learning targets up. I hope that's okay. I hope that's not too teachery. But here's what I'd like to focus on for our session goals tonight. I'm hopeful that we can reflect on the opportunity that our local schools are taking to recenter Indigenous American voices and perspectives, and consider what we can do to recenter Indigenous voices and perspectives in our own context. That means like your context. So I hope that we can make this something which is definitely a window into what's going on in the public schools, but also make it relevant to your life as well. Although I probably should acknowledge that many people here likely have or are connected to somebody who's in the public schools. Do you all have kids, grandkids, relatives who are in the Albemarle County public school system? I see thumbs up and nods. Sure, so absolutely, that's cool. And certainly I see many of my own colleagues here, and even some of my own kids' teachers, so that's wonderful. So it'll be relevant to you in that sense. But I also want to think about how we can apply this to our own lives and to the organizations that you're a part of. And so here's how we'll know we're successful tonight. If you can describe what erasure looks like, and we'll talk about that term a little bit. I know you've heard it if you've been part of this series so far. What erasure looks like in public schools, and perhaps for you personally. And also we'll consider ourselves successful if you can describe what the counties are doing to counter that erasure. And perhaps what you can do personally as well. So I'll get back at the end. We'll see if we hit those targets, and you can give me a grade here for this session, maybe in the feedback form. All right. So here's the agenda. This is largely going to be through some stories that I'll tell. And I will definitely share some ongoing ACPS projects, but I'm going to make an effort not to make this too like school technical oriented. It could, I could put this presentation together talking all about school projects, but I'll try to make it story oriented because I think that will make it a little bit more interesting. But I will share some of the ongoing projects, and then we'll, like Carolyn said, we'll have space for some Q&A and some learning target check. And Carolyn, I invite you to help me keep track of the time so we can be sure that we hold space for that and hit all the targets.
Okay.
All right. All right, so let's start off. Again, I know that if you've been part of this series, and perhaps if you've been connected to this work, this term erasure is a term that you might be familiar with. But I want to start by norming around it a little bit and telling some stories to define what erasure means. And I'm actually going to start in around 2016, so go back a few years. I'm going to go back after that into the 1980s, into my own childhood. And I'm going to make this a little bit personal at the beginning, and then fast forward all the way, more or less up to the present. So let's see if we can follow along it with that order. Okay. So 2016 in Albemarle County Public Schools. This was my 12th year in education. At this time, I wasn't an equity specialist. I was an instructional coach, which means like a coach for teachers. We help on professional development, help make sure that people are finding success in their classrooms, work with one-on-one with teachers and with teams of teachers as well. And I was at that time increasingly focused on equitable outcomes for students. I saw the inequitable outcomes that were present in many spaces. And I figured if I couldn't coach teachers to address those, that inequitable landscape, then it didn't feel like I was really doing the job I needed to do. And so I was looking at that in a number of different ways, and leading work with my coach colleagues on culturally responsive teaching. That's me there. I circled myself there because my wife says I might look that good if I shave my face and cut my hair. I doubt that that's true anymore. But there I am in 2016. Seems like forever ago. So I'm doing this work, and I'm in a meeting, an informal meeting, doing some professional development with a friend of mine, This is Sita, and Sita is now, since that time she left the county and then she came back. She's now the principal of Murray Elementary School. And this picture is from the newspaper just over the weekend. And Sita said something to me that, which was, it caught my attention. It was interesting. She said, Lars, we're talking about culturally responsive teaching here. Are you aware of the Virginia tribes, of the Virginia nations? Have you made contact with them? Have you talked to them? And I was excited about the prospect of doing that, but I have to admit that I was a little bit surprised. That was not something that I had considered or thought about up until that moment. And so I want to just put in a little pause to process here. Why would I be surprised in that moment? You can, if you want to use the chat function to offer some answers, you can, but you can just reflect on that question for a moment. Why is it surprising to me all of a sudden in my adult life, 2016, to learn that there are a number of Virginia Indian tribes, that they're all around, that they're alive and well and healthy and able to be in communication with? Why would that be surprising to me? Yeah, Marnie says you were taught in school that they had been moved out. Absolutely. Thanks for that, Marnie. Well, the answer really goes all the way back to this question of erasure. And this is the way I'm going to use this term tonight. I'm going to define it as the apparent invisibility of one group of people to another that results from both the lack of or the inaccurate presence in the cultural narrative. So this is not, although certainly genocide and the actual removal of people and the genocide of people is a real thing and a serious thing, and something that is necessary to talk about and to think about and consider and learn about. Here, I mean, when there are people who are actually right around you in your midst, and if you fail to see them for some reason, because in your cultural narrative, they either aren't presenced or the way that they're presenced is inaccurate. That is what I'm going to call erasure. And I want to talk a little bit just about how that happened for me personally, and I think how that happens for so many people who don't have Native, Indian, or Indigenous heritage. So that takes me back into the 1980s. So here I am as a kid in 1989. I grew up in Westchester, New York. It's a little bit north of New York City. I think that's around the time of this picture dates too. I'm about 8 years old. I love playing outside, and I have this romanticized interest in Native Americans. And so, what does that look like? Well, these are some actual artifacts from my own childhood. So, for example, this gift shop here is called the Indian TP Gift Shop. It's still up there in Lake George, New York. I would go up there each summer. I would beg my family to take me to places like this. It probably advantages from the fact that Lake George is the setting for James Fenimore Cooper's Last Mohicans. And, I was reading books like this. Some of you might be familiar with the author of this, Charles Eastman. He's a Dakota physician, historian, and author. This is a dream catcher that I made as a kid, hung in my grandfather's house up until his passing. And I kind of still have that tucked away. I grabbed that, and I used to collect these postcards. These are Edward Curtis postcards who made these portrait photos. And I had this romanticized vision here. What was honest was that there was a yearning. I know that I had some sort of yearning. I was reaching out for some sort of connection, but it was really confused by misinformation, because most of the messages I was getting here guided me to think about Native Americans in monolithic terms, or at least very minimally as culturally distinct groups. So I had a poster, I remember a poster on the ceiling over my bunk bed with the English name versions of tribes across North America. So at least I had some basic idea of distinctions. But you see these things like the teepee, the dream catcher, the headdress, these dominated the visual cues I was receiving. And then also, very significantly, they all relegated Native Americans to the past. And so this is almost embarrassing, of course, to share. You know, my parents were and they are amazing. They put up with me still, and they made Halloween costumes and that my brother and I wore. And when I asked my mom about this one, she didn't even recall that it had anything to do with Native Americans. But I'm sure that I begged her to make this, and it's just a sort of confused thing that I had in mind. You know, it's obviously confused. My brother here is dressed up like Hulk Hogan, by the way, and that's a whole other confusing thing. But zooming out, I guess I just want to say that the majority culture, I think, is often like this a bit, you know, because of taking so much, because of privilege. There's just a lot of confusion. And sometimes an analogy I think of is like a spoiled child that's, you know, says I want, but it can't ever be satisfied. It's just confused about what it actually wants. I think there's a lot of potential to be out of touch under those conditions, and that's some of what we're seeing. In my line of work, I hear people with privilege say, you know, I don't have a culture a lot, or they look at a group of people with a strong sense of cultural identity and they sort of marvel at it. But of course, everyone has a culture. It's just that if you're always outward facing, always hungry, it can be hard to see and nurture your own culture thoughtfully. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent. But I think it's irrelevant here. It's relevant because these things don't happen just out of nowhere. You know, this is my own dad, probably at about my age, at the age I am right now, and he's a lover of nature, a conservationist by occupation. He spent his career working for the Wildlife Conservation Society, a hunter, a general outdoorsman. When I was young, we would watch these 1970s versions of the Deer Slayer and the Last of the Mohicans together. I had talked to him the other day on the phone and asked him what he grew up with. He grew up recalling a 1930s, a 36 version of that film. And then, of course, when the 1991 film came out with Daniel Day-Lewis, we watched that over and over again. That was very much a part of my narrative as a kid, you know. And my dad was sensitive to Native American perspectives on these movies. The movie Black Robe came out, I think, the year just before this, and he cared about how those films were received by Native American communities. And I remember him talking about it. He grew up in South Jersey. His father would take him out when they turned the fields. His father would take him out looking for arrowheads and other artifacts. And so that messaging, I guess my point here is that messaging that Native American people are in the past and that romanticization of the past, that's something that's developed over generations. And it, you know, it can continue as well. So these are, you know, it's quite possible for this pattern to continue if we're not careful and we don't take the time to educate ourselves and make conscious choices to do something differently. So for example, this is a actual, you know, dream catcher kit that somebody gave to us. I don't think we hung on to this. I think we let this one continue on. But you know, one of my kids' favorite movies is Moana. Even though I talked to them about a colleague I have who's of Native Hawaiian descent, and she won't watch this film, fear of cultural appropriation, stereotypes, and misinformation, which surely makes its way in there. You know, and so we have to take the things that we inherit, that we receive here, and contextualize them for kids. And I'm grateful to say that increasingly, you know, we can find books and other resources that are authored by Native and Indigenous people and read them. You know, I try to read them with my own kids and have these conversations and begin to build out their context and their critical view and their cultural aperture. You know, so we need to make an effort, I think, to search these things out and use them thoughtfully as we raise and educate kids. These are my own 3 daughters here, by the way. That they're 3, 6, and 8, and I'm reading a book that Mary Wilson here has recommended to us. Mary, that's the Christopher Kologer book, incidentally. So what we're talking about here, and I promise this is the only other kind of technical term I'll use for the evening, is enculturation. So enculturation is what happens when we lift up values, norms, imagery, and then that gets acquired generationally within a culture. And so those images, those values, those stories become part of our personal narrative, and they inform our whole outlook that we have of the world. And so if that narrative says that Native Americans look like this, or they're the subject of adventure stories that happened in the past, that really impacts the way that we see the world. I know it did for me, and it does for kids. Kids are impressionable, and these are the messages that we send to them, and that's why we need to be very careful about that. And I guess I want to say too that, as much as we might think these days of education and school of being synonymous, of course, raising kids is much older than school. And so this process of enculturation, it occurs inside and outside of school. And schools need to acknowledge that they are performing an act of enculturation. If they're conscious of that, I think it's quite possible to do school to educate kids in a way that's culturally sustaining for diverse people. But if we're not conscious of the fact that schools perform the act of enculturation, if they don't stay conscious of that, then I think it's quite possible for schools to become blindly indoctrinating. And that's, of course, incredibly problematic. And that's a lot of what I address in the work that I do. So we'll pause here for just a moment. And I want to invite you to make a personal connection. And again, if you want to, you can put that in the chat. You need not, but I welcome it. I'm curious to hear what are some images or moments from your own enculturated story around Native, Indian, or Indigenous people. We have folks spanning several generations, I think, in the conversation tonight. So it will be interesting to hear what some of those images or moments are. And I also want to acknowledge as well that, of course, there are people here tonight with Native, Indian, or Indigenous heritage. And so, of course, this question is for everybody. Take a moment to Thanksgiving stories, sure, timely. Yes, the Lewis and Clark journey. Yes. You were referring to some of the books that they read. Absolutely. Dance, yep, and some of the movies, absolutely. Yeah. People who were lucky enough to read Indigenous people's history of the United States got a re-education, perhaps, as I did. The Lone Ranger and Tonto, yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Carolyn. Sure, so we can see how these things become part of the story that we tell and the images that we anchor in our mind, and that really, in the most holistic sense, in the broadest sense, I think that is what we're talking about when we're talking about education. Although now I'll turn back to what that looks like when we're dealing with it in our schools. So I do want to fast forward all the way up to the present, or just about the present. My friend Sita, who had left the county, but that seed that she had planted in my mind was finally beginning to sprout, just as our division was writing this new strategic plan. And my position had changed at this point. I'd become an equity specialist, this role that I currently have with the county. And so my role positioned me in a way that I could now support the division level processes like this, like writing and considering the strategic plan. And it was, equity is on everybody's minds these days. It's certainly something that many organizations are concerning themselves with. And so it wasn't lost on Albemarle County Public Schools that we wanted to include the community more than we ever had in the past in building this strategic plan. And so we invited widely as we could, and took stock of who could participate, who would partner in this visioning process. But I was conscious of the fact that we were still missing significant voices when making these decisions and inviting, having people at the table, a seat at the table, and that included partnerships with Native, Indian, and Indigenous people. And so it just seemed to me that the thing to do at that moment was to start building some partnerships. You know, actually, when I started talking to people about this and saying, hey, you know, do we have any Native or Virginia Indian voices that we can reach out to? Who do you know? I was talking to leadership. One of the most common things that people would say was, do we have Native American students? How many Native American students do we have here? We don't, I think we only have a few, you know? And it turns out that that's not true. That's an example of erasure that we were all experiencing, or that many people were experiencing here. So I knew I needed to reach out and begin to make some partnerships. And I want to give credit to some people along the way here. First, to Rachel Spraker in the UVA Division of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, because she connected me to other folks like Mike and Mary Wilson, Teresa Pollock from the Monacan Indian Nation. I also reached out to the Virginia Tribal Education Consortium, which I'll talk a bit about in a moment. They represent the educational interests of the 7 federally recognized tribes in Virginia. And I just began with conversations. You know, part of me wanted to jump right in and say, hey, we have this strategic plan that we're writing, and you know, we love your input, and maybe that there would have been something of benefit to that, but also without any relationship and with a whole lot of historical baggage, it felt like the right thing to do was just to begin by having conversations and making friendships and really listening to how we could be better partners, and to frame it in the desire to be better partners for the long run, rather than just jumping right in with an ask. So I began to have these conversations and to listen to what people were saying, and you know, folks had a lot to say, and you know, quickly some trends began to emerge, and so people wanted to know who are our Native, Indian, or Indigenous communities in the Albemarle County Public Schools, and what are their outcomes and what are their experiences. Those were not questions that I was easily prepared to answer right off the bat, or that anybody really that I knew, other educators, for the most part, could answer at that moment in time. Folks asked, you know, what do your educators know, or what do they need to know? What do they need to understand and be able to do in order to teach Virginia Indian or Indian students, and also to be able to teach the general population of students in a way which is respectful and honest and truthful. What curriculum needs to change was another question that came up. Folks were mindful that the curriculum was told through a colonialist narrative and was inadequate and had that sort of erasure and that misinformation in it. And also, you know, who else do we need to partner with? Like, what community partnerships? So not just who's our internal community, but who's our external community that we need to partner with as well. There were many conversations and many, a lot of texture to those conversations, but these were big trends which came up over and over again. So just to say those same things through the lens of erasure, I would say, you know, we didn't know much about our internal community, our educators, speaking in general terms, because there is texture there too, but many of our educators were unaware of Indigenous perspectives, or if they held Indigenous perspectives themselves, they felt that they were not valued. Our curriculum, as I mentioned, you know, in many cases misrepresented or lacked Indigenous authors and perspectives. We didn't know who our external community was. So these were all the same themes, but kind of framed through that lens of erasure. So I want to spend a moment talking about this first one, who our internal community was, and what I learned there, and what we began to learn about ourselves as a school system. And I'll tell some stories there, and then maybe I'll shift gears and stop kind of this narrative mode, and we'll take a look at some of the projects that relate to these other areas. Okay, so let's talk about the landscape of American Indian students in Albemarle County Public Schools. And again, I want to be careful with language. And so this term American Indian, this term American Indian student here, I'm using in a specific way to refer to a racial category as it appears as a choice for students when they register in the public schools. And so that's a federal racial designation. And when students join the county, when you have a child and the child is of age to enter the public schools, or if they enter from another space, the family will designate, is required to designate the race or races of that child. And American Indian is the choice, which is one of the choices which is presented there. And so that's the specific way that I want to use that term here, because people may make that choice even if that's not the way that they would describe themselves under other circumstances, of course. So we have at the time that these numbers always fluctuate just a little bit, but remain at about this place. About 14,349 students in Albemarle County Public Schools in 2020 to 21. And how many do you think identify as American Indian or registered? You can put a number in the chat there if you want to take a guess. I have guesses that are just all over the place, so don't be shy about guesses.
I'm happy to read them out to you.
Yeah, no, I see them. 143,
Oh, you do?
1%. Yeah, 550. Yeah. 11%. Yes, we have lots of. Absolutely. 200. Yeah. Well, remember when I talked to people at the beginning, folks said, how many students do we have? I don't think people would say I don't think it's that many. I really don't think that we have that many students. Yeah. All right. I could see some of the people that we have some educators in here who I've spoken with about this too. Yeah. So here's how it breaks down. Thanks for those guesses. Thanks for offering them up, by the way. So there are, this was the first thing that popped up. So I talked to our data people and asked to help begin crunching some numbers. And the first number that they came back with was 17 students. So 17 students represented as American Indian racially, with just American Indian as their racial selection and no other races selected. And that was similar to kind of what people were expecting. And that's why often when you see data reported, if you see data reported for the public schools, you won't see those students represented because the number is so small that they don't represent it. And so that was the first number that came back. But then after some, as a little bit of time, we looked a little bit further and they said, okay, wait a second. We think that actually some of this information is getting buried a little bit because there are 76 students in addition to those 17 students who are represented as multiracial and non-Hispanic Latino. So that's an additional 76 students who identified as American Indian racially, and then also another race as well. And the way we look at data in the public schools, those students would never appear as American Indian students, they would appear as multiracial students. So we sat on that and talked about that for a little bit. And then they said, okay, hang on, wait a second, we found something else that we need to talk about. And that was that there are 604 students who are represented as Hispanic Latino ethnically and American Indian racially. Now, in order to understand what that means, it's a little bit necessary to talk about the way that these categories work. So Hispanic Latino, again, this is another category that people choose. I know that these may or may not be terms that people own themselves, but that Hispanic Latino is an ethnic category which people either select Hispanic Latino or non-Hispanic Latino. And it's not a racial selection. And so anybody that selects Hispanic Latino or non-Hispanic Latino also selects a race. However, when we look at data, and even when the state looks at data and presents data on student outcomes, they classify Hispanic Latino as a race. They look at students who have identified as Hispanic Latino as a racial category, even though they also have to select a race. And so that means that the racial selection, American Indian, is lost within this Hispanic Latino designation. So these students who have identified racially as American Indian and Hispanic Latino get grouped together with the larger body of students who are Hispanic Latino in Albemarle County Public Schools. And so that's interesting, and that says something. And I want to pause just for a moment to consider what that means. Incidentally, here's how students break out across what we call feeder patterns. So in Albemarle County Public Schools, we have a northern or a north central feeder pattern, a western and a southern feeder pattern. And you can see that they're unevenly distributed across those feeder patterns. Some of them are enrolled in virtual school this year. That's an option. So just pause the process for a moment and consider, what does this say about the role of race in the process of erasure? And again, I would invite you to put some thoughts in the chat if you want to share. Relegated to other. Nice. Yeah. Mike, can you unmute and say a bit more about what you mean by that?
Going to other, it's that designation when it doesn't fit into the nice, neat little boxes that the powers that be have. And it was one of the things that we saw with Native students at UVA, that they wound up they didn't break out the Native student population, and they grouped them into other. So, and it becomes non-reflective, which is just another form of erasure.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for sharing. It's I feel conflicted about this in some ways in my job, because of course, like, if we don't have some ways to track patterns, then it's possible to miss inequity. But the reason, of course, that as we're seeing that's problematic is that we're naming the choices for people, and it's very reductive, and people have a forced choice, and that forced choice makes for a lot of misidentification and confusion in the data. And I absolutely agree. I think that there's that this is a one form of erasure. There's one question that I know, Carolyn, you may want to save questions for the answer, but this one just caught my eye from Linda and Frank Dukes. Do parents fill out these categories each year, or only when registering for the first time? Every family has the option at the beginning of each year to update registration information. Most don't take it, and that's something that I have been working with the Virginia Tribal Education Consortium to talk about, like whether we make some sort of concerted effort to advertise some more information and increase the ability of our student information systems to account for the variety of people's identities by adding other fields, or a space for heritage, and also to acknowledge some of the work that we're doing on this topic, so that people have, of course, it would be a choice to add that aspect of identity, but it's something that we're looking at here. But yeah, the direct answer to your question is that they have the choice to update that information each year, but most folks who are already enrolled don't do it. Yeah. Lots of great questions in there and comments in the chat. I think I'll kind of save some for the end here. I also, it's really not responsible to talk about. I'm not going to go in depth on this topic, particularly because I'm not a scholar. But it would be inappropriate to talk about racial erasure without talking about Walter Plecker and the Racial Integrity Act, and so of 1924. If that's not something that you're familiar with, I know that some of the other speakers have touched on it, but I guess suffice to say, in this moment, that this part of American history literally erased Indian identities off of birth certificates and committed other acts of what was come to be known as paper genocide that was devastating for many Virginia Indians, and the local Monacan Indians were a particular target of this act. And if it's something that you're not familiar with, I do encourage you to learn more about it. It's an important part of history, and we're beginning to talk about it in Albemarle County Public Schools, and I think that that's important that we do that. So of course we wanted, it was revealing to many of us to begin to understand that we had so many students who were identifying as American Indian. And the next question, next obvious question that I and many people wanted to know was, what do outcomes for American Indian students look like in Albemarle County Public Schools? So we're in my role, and increasingly in school systems, it's becoming common to make equity dashboards where you kind of display these patterns. And let's see if I click on this, if you'll track with me. This is something of what an equity dashboard looks like. Okay, where you see things like who's identified as gifted, who are students with disabilities, who's chronically absent, and so on and so forth. You look at a number of things like suspension, you look at these data points, and then you break it out, in this case, across a demographic group like whether Asian, Black, Hispanic. These are the categories I was describing earlier. But because we weren't taking stock of our American Indian students, we weren't including them in equity tables. And so we crunched those numbers a little bit to see what we could find. And you always want to be very careful not to jump to conclusions when you do this, but it's a starting point for understanding the landscape. Are we back on the presentation? Did you all track me there?
We are.
Okay. You go back. Thanks. So here are some of the general patterns that we saw, that there were some, what we describe as like disproportionately negative outcomes. So underrepresentation and gifted identification, overrepresentation in students with disabilities, and chronic absenteeism. There were also some positive outcomes, like high outcomes in early advanced math or for advanced diplomas. And these over here, if you can follow my mouse, show if that pattern is present for just American Indian students, or for American Indian students and multiracial students who also identify as American Indian, and so on and so forth. One of the most interesting things to me that I want to mention here is that we crunched a different table for career and technical education programs, because in our partnership with the Virginia Tribal Education Consortium, that's a particular outcome which is of interest to them. They want to be sure that Virginia Indian students are graduating career ready, and oftentimes it's possible to graduate high school with a degree or a technical certification that makes you graduate, allows you to graduate job ready. And what we found there was that disproportionately American Indian students, as well as all students of color, were graduating without what's called completion status or completer status, which means that they were taking some career and technical education courses, but they weren't accumulating to graduation with a certification to the same extent that their white peers were. And so that's a pattern that we need to begin to address and begin to plan around.
Quick question, Lars.
Okay, so yes, absolutely.
So someone asked, and I think it's a good point, how many students were represented in the American Indian in those statistics? Was it the 17 that had identified, or was it the other group where they were also, like, how big of a pool was that?
Yeah, it's the nearly 100 or so who were identifying as American Indian, specifically non-Hispanic Latino. And so we need to look at all of those numbers in a number of different ways. Yep, it's a great question. So, this is early kind of work that I was doing and talking about. On the side, of course, I'm doing my own learning and having these conversations with people, looking at the data. reading, researching. These are texts, and incidentally, I know that some of them have been raised in this chat and in previous session that are great and specific to learning about our local Monacan Indian Nation and recommended by folks in the Monacan Nation as well. And so, having all these and beginning to talk a little bit publicly about this as I'm learning, should be able to share it and to kind of raise the awareness in conversations. And I do a lot of professional development. And so mentioning it in our professional development around culturally responsive teaching and other topics. And an interesting thing began to happen, which maybe this was easy for you to anticipate, but the more we talk about this, the more educators, students, and families kind of begin to come forward and tell their stories, which is, that's what you want to happen. That's like a bit of, the opposite of erasure, when people have the power to and feel empowered to come and share and to talk about their experiences. So I'll take you through just a couple of these, or maybe 2 or 3. I'll try to keep my eye on the time here. So, this story is about an educator who came to me after I was sharing some of these statistics and looking at some of these numbers. And this is actually a quote from one of this educator's child. This educator has 3 kids of his own in our public schools. And I was, had finished up some professional development, and he came up and he said, Lars, you put those numbers up there and they may be surprising to a lot of people, but they're not really surprising to me. I am a citizen of the Monacan Indian Nation, and that's not something that I feel comfortable talking about a lot. And so we began to discuss this, and he said, I was in a conversation, ironically, about culturally responsive teaching, and I was with administrators, and I brought up the fact that I'm this is my heritage, and they didn't take it seriously. They thought I was joking and actually thought I was demeaning, because this is a person who appeared to them like a white man, and so there was something that they were expecting. And he said, I already feel a bit on the like people don't respect my viewpoint as a conservative kind of rural white man. And when I shared this, they thought I was they kind of put it down and put it away. And he said that before that point, I hadn't really been concerned with getting my official citizenship. I knew my own family heritage. I knew that, this is obviously a big part of my family's culture. But after that, I went and I, applied and got my citizenship card officially recognized, and got it for my 3 kids as well. But it began this dialogue that we had about his perspective and his experience. And he teaches from this point of perspective and has a much more nuanced understanding of these issues, and conveys that to the students in his class. But he also shared some of what his own children were talking about. And one of them said, I'm going to quit telling people that I'm a Monacan Indian, because when I tell them, they look at me weird, they don't believe me, same as was true for their dad. And that's interesting. That's an unfortunate story. We continue to keep in touch, though, and as awareness increases in the county, I'm hopeful, and he's hopeful, and this is something which I think is shifting, but there's a lot of work. It's very telling that he would have this experience, and that his kids would have this experience as well. The second one, I almost want to, I think Lanika is here, and I would almost invite Lanika to share. I'll say just a few words, Lanika, and then maybe Carolyn, you can set Lanika up to unmute and say a few words. So Lanika is a colleague that I had worked with for some time in equity work, but was not aware that Lanika had this whole side of her family, which was Halawasaponi, until we began to talk about it in our conversations. And Lanika said, yes, this is something I'd like to connect on, and we began to talk. And it was then that Lanika shared some of her own heritage and what this meant to her. And she's a science teacher at Albemarle High School, and she works increasingly these days to recenter Indigenous perspectives in science. Lanika, what do you want to say? Maybe you want to hop on the mic. As long as people are around, I'd like them to tell their stories.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for just giving me a moment to say just a little bit. I am very appreciative of Lars and my colleagues for opening up this opportunity. Like as Lars was saying, the Hawasaponi tribe is a part of my heritage, but they pretty much have been erased from the vocabulary or the connection of my maternal side of the family because of strife and erasures, but not necessarily pertaining to Indigenous and the white community, but Indigenous and the Black community. So when Lars was talking about race and paper erasure, in 1927, I've been doing some digging about my ancestry, and I found out that one of my great-grandmother's sisters passed away at the age of 5. She was born in Halifax County, Hollister, North Carolina. Her name was Blanche Richardson, and she passed away in the Isle of Wight, actually in Virginia. And I found that out, which is not too far from us. But her birth certificate at birth said Indian, but when she died at the age of 5, the birth certificate said colored. So there's so much that I'm finding out about my ancestry and about the movement of the people who are part of the Hawasaponi tribe, all up and down the East Coast, Lynchburg, Charlottesville, Isle of Wight, and where I'm from, I'm close to Halifax County, North Carolina. And as a science teacher, and I'm going to pause here, as a science teacher, I'm very excited to have the opportunity that the county has afforded now for me to include conversations about ethnobotany and other Indigenous-centered heritage and culture with all students, because I think it helps, like Lars says, erase the erasure. And so Lars and I have been talking, and we thought how cool it would be for students and their families to be able to be a part of this conversation. And so we are thinking about how we could maybe create like a postcard campaign and open up a door for families to decide for themselves how they want to be included in our conversations about the expansion of all content areas in terms of Indigenous impact and Indigenous histories and culture in our conversations. And so this is an example of a postcard that we were thinking about creating. One of my most special memories in connection with our conversation tonight is just sitting outside and walking around with my grandmother and great-grandmother, and them sharing with me information about the plants that they would use, to like heal and to help us to feel better. I remember my grandma used to brew a tea for us when we had a stomach ache, because we lived in a rural area and we didn't always have access to go to Walmart. We didn't have Walmart then. So, but this is a great example of something that I would share with my students in my science classes. We have lots of ash trees where I'm from. And so my great-grandmother would take the flowers from the ash tree and create a salve for our skin to help with like burns. We didn't have aloe plants or any other skin disorders like acne. And so this is just one way that we are hoping to encourage support and invite partnerships from our school community to explore their Native American, Indigenous, and Indian heritage. So I'm very excited, and I appreciate you, Lars, for giving me the space to discuss my search to learn more about my African and Native American ancestry.
Appreciate you too, Lanika. Yeah, absolutely. Lanika talked about the different ways to create an environment where students can embrace their own heritage and come forward and talk about this aspect of their identity. There's certainly something that you don't want to do, which has been done in school systems before, and I've seen it done even in Albemarle County public school systems, and that's where you use the information that you have about families and then inappropriately do outreach. So for example, to find all of the families who have registered their children as American Indian and reach out to them as a group would be an inappropriate thing to do. And there's a history of people doing things like that based on student and family race that is and can be incredibly offensive. And so what we like to do is find other ways for students to understand that this is an issue that we care about. We want people to embrace their heritage and begin to come forward and share if that's something that feels comfortable. We want them to feel that this is a welcoming space to do that. So I appreciate all of Lanika's efforts. Lanika talks a lot about Indigenous perspectives, as I mentioned, in science. And it's just an eye opener, I think, for students to see that this kind of Western approach to science is just but one of the many ways of looking at the world. I'll just say this last bit really quickly, that what Lanika was describing there is not unique to her perspective. There's another educator from the Chickahominy tribe, a Chickahominy citizen in Albemarle County Public Schools, that asked, are there kids today that are less familiar with their Indian heritage as a result of pressures from the majority culture? So obviously the acts of genocide, the pressure that colonization put on communities means that in many cases families didn't discuss or didn't share that aspect of their heritage. And so this educator shared that was true for them, and growing up they didn't hear as much about their heritage, even though it was right there. And when they began to ask, they uncovered a lot, and from their grandparents and from their father were able to learn a lot and begin to reintegrate and re-embrace that aspect of their identity. But this educator asked, I'm sure, they said, I'm sure that there are kids today that are less familiar with that aspect of their identity because of those pressures. So that's the type of erasure that, of course, that we're trying to deal with. So you don't need to, and especially keeping an eye on the time, you don't need to answer this one in the chat. But certainly these stories may add some texture to your understanding of how race contributes to erasure. You can pause just for a moment to consider how these stories kind of add to that perspective. I think people are expecting to see something in particular when they think about Indian or Native American people, and when that doesn't accord with their, the boxed understandings of race that we've inherited, then they're susceptible to a form of erasure. I guess I should touch on this. I want to make sure that we use our time properly. I've got a lot I would love to talk about. I think it's important to say this quickly because we discussed those some 600 students who identify as Hispanic, Latino, and also American Indian. So I've talked to the ESOL office, the community of people who are coming from countries throughout Mexico and Central America, and particularly Guatemala and El Salvador, do have indigenous heritage from those areas. And so sometimes families coming from those areas speak an indigenous language as their first language, with Spanish as a second language. And it's because these families must choose a racial designation. They see American Indian and reasonably understand that to mean indigenous to the Americas, rather than what many of us would think when we saw American Indian and think about the United States of America. They're looking at America as North, Central, South America, and so that is a logical choice, and that constitutes a big number of students. And when you add all of those students together, we are looking at about 5% of our overall population. That includes 600 students who identify as Hispanic Latino, plus the multiracial families and families that just identify as American Indian. Let's keep going. I guess what I've touched on this a little bit. We're still learning, and in partnership with the Virginia Tribal Education Consortium and other groups, working to understand the experiences beyond the numbers, the actual lived experiences of students and families who identify as Native American, Indian, or Indigenous in Albemarle County Public Schools. Definitely, again, people are coming forward, not just educators, but students and families, and students are beginning to talk about their experiences and, in some cases, how they have a preference for a term, but that preference is overridden by their teachers, who I think are, in some kind of good faith, trying to be politically correct, but are asserting their what they think they've learned, even in the face of students asserting that this is a part of their identity. So these are all challenges which we'll continue to face, and I think it's necessary that that we face them. It's in a way, it's hopeful that they're coming up so that we can deal with them, because up until this point, people have largely felt silent or silenced on these issues. So I'll pivot a little bit, and we won't have time to look at all of these things, but we talked about this first one. Now I could talk about these other topics like professional development for educators in the ACPS community. I could talk about revisions to our curriculum. I could talk about the partnerships that we're working on. But I also want to leave time for Q&A. So Carolyn, how much time do you want to leave for Q&A at the end here?
It totally is up to you. Do you want to? I think you've put a lot out there, and people might have a lot of good questions. So maybe at least 15 minutes.
Sure. Let's do this then. That'll leave us about 8 minutes extra until that time. So why don't people put in the chat what they'd like to hear a little bit more about? And here are your 3 choices, and we'll try to go. Carolyn, you can help me make a choice based on what people prefer. We can talk about professional development for ACPS teachers, what they're engaging with for their own learning. We can talk about curriculum, or we can talk about partnerships. Those are the 3 choices. So PD, curriculum, or partnerships. Go ahead and put your own choice in the chat, and maybe Carolyn and I'll look for some trends there.
I'm seeing curriculum.
Oh, that's a lot of curriculum, huh? All right. Okay, all right. That's easy. That's a done deal. Okay, I'll breeze through the other slides so you can kind of see what's in there, but I won't pause to talk about them. Let's see what I do first. So this are all about professional development, curriculum revisions. Okay, so good. The explicit education, not the kind of undercurrent messages about Native Americans, but the actual topic of Native Americans and Virginia Indians begins in elementary school in 2nd grade, and then in 4th grade. And in 4th grade in particular, I'll highlight this as an example. The 4th grade Virginia Indian inquiry used to focus solely on the Powhatan Confederacy, and it was told through the lens of a colonialist narrative, and it kept Virginia Indians stories in the past tense, and so that's what it used to look like. And I am hopeful that at the state level, this is something which is getting attention. They have a culturally relevant teaching group which involves the executive director, Chief Ken Adams, who's on the VTech board, the Virginia Tribal Education Board, and I think that they're working slowly at the state level to address revisions here. But in our schools, we were anxious to move a bit more quickly if we could do so respectfully. So our teachers looked at that curriculum in the 4th grade and began to make some updates. And those updates included focusing on the Monacan Indian Nation primarily, and then with connections to the Powhatan Confederacy also, because we feel it's important to learn our local history first and then connect outward from there. And so rather than have it be told through that colonialist lens, we gave students opportunities to construct their learning, put primary sources in front of them, and ask them critical questions. We worked with folks from the Monacan Indian Nation to source and to vet some of the resources that we were using, and of course included current perspectives and interests as well, so that Virginia Indians were not only looked at as something in the past. And so these are just artifacts from that. So videos that focus on the Monacan Indian Nation. That's Professor Jeffrey Hantman, who wrote Monacan Millennium and centered Virginia Indian Voices. And Razawek is the historical capital of the Monacan Indian Nation. It's among the most endangered historical site. I think it's in like the top 11 nationally endangered historical sites because it's being considered as I believe a water pumping station for Zion's Crossroads. And so the preservation of that site is something which is among the present concerns for the Monacan Nation. And we give students the opportunity and set them up to unpack that and examine that issue and work on it. Those are examples of just kind of just a highlight of the curriculum. I'll also just say though that our partnership with the Virginia Tribal Education Consortium, we're really just fortunate to have it. We actually, I'll mention, I'll kind of put this up here, that this last week we signed a formal partnership agreement with the Virginia Tribal Education Consortium. And I've been working for about 1.5 years with just a fantastic educator from that group. Her name is Cara Canaday. And she is a great assistance to us and is working with our social studies elementary department on an effort called Reframing the Narrative, where they're really looking at all of their curriculum to be sure that it is honest and respectful and truthful to Native and Indian and Indigenous perspectives and Virginia Indian perspectives in particular. And so that's one piece of this partnership agreement that relates to our curricular updates, but it's an important one, as you all seem to point out. So that brings us almost to quarter of. Maybe this is the time to pause. I can touch those other areas, professional development or partnerships a little bit more if they come up in the questions. But Carolyn, what do you want to uplift from the chat?
Yeah, so if you want to stop sharing your screen, is that possible?
Absolutely.
Just so we can get a little better bandwidth for you, that'd be great.
I'd love to see more faces. Yeah.
Okay. And also, very early on, you were reading a book to your children, and you mentioned it was one Mary and Mike had given you, and somebody wants to know the name of that book. Do you?
The name of that book was Christopher Kaloger, It's Over. And I'll say that that was a good book, and it's not my favorite book of all of the books that we've discussed, but it's we anytime we get a recommendation, gosh, we read anything that's recommended to us that might help us correct the narrative, and we unpack it and discuss it as a family. And so that was in the queue there.
Great. Okay. When you asked us to pause and give examples, there were a lot of, I thought, really good examples that people gave that just brought forward how much misinformation and how small of a piece that we received growing up that really shaped us in our own perceived narrative of Indigenous peoples. So I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who put those things down in the chat.
I appreciate that too. Yeah, I would just say that that's all I consider. Began at that point because I think although I'm talking largely about public schools, and it's my job to do that, education is something that we all do. We all take responsibility for raising kids, and so I think it's important to zoom out and look at it from that perspective as well.
Let's see. And then Sarah had mentioned that the Indian boarding schools, and she put PA, I'm not sure if that's in Pennsylvania, but force children to renounce their tribal IDs. And I can't remember if I read it here, but I have heard many people say that to identify as an American Indian has not always been something because of erasure, because of, it's like we don't talk about that. So I don't know if you want to speak to that, if you've ever had people sharing about that.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. There are still people, as Lanika mentioned, who have lived through that period, or are just like one generation away from that, even more so, who can speak to that form of paper erasure, have experienced it. When Chief Emeritus Ken Adams came to the school board meeting to last week to sign that partnership agreement, and he relayed this thing, which I've heard him speak of a number of times, but that was that he's from a family of 10 kids, and in his family, he and a friend of his were the first Virginia Indians to graduate from a public high school. That up until that point in 1965, the schools were segregated, and people often, certainly wasn't part of the history that I received, but the segregation of the schools, there was a white school, an African-American school, and for him, the Sharon Indian school, and all of his other siblings were shipped out to, or forcibly removed, or in some cases, I think I understand they also had to pay to finish high school out in Oklahoma or in other states. And so you can just imagine the tragedy, for a family that would bring.
Yeah. Somebody said how wonderful that Albemarle County schools have embarked on this mission to, in quotes, correct the narrative of what's being taught to today's students. Wish it had been that way when I was in school. Will pushback against critical race theory result in blocking the teaching of a more accurate narrative about Virginia's Indigenous history and culture?
I think that the jury's a little bit out on that one. I hate to say that. I think we'll have to wait and see a little bit. What I am encouraged about is that locally we have a school board, and a bit of insulation, which would allow us to consider history and current reality through the lens of race. And so, for the time being, I think that leeway is there. But in the most extreme and restrictive vision of the future, that obviously that can become complicated and problematic. And so, I'm an optimist, but I'm gonna keep my fingers crossed on that one and just try to kind of keep finding the opportunities. Can I address this one from Stephen here about? Please. Stephen asks, how does public education system move away from the heroic white man colonialist narrative? It seems though there's strong resistance to teaching anything else. I love that question. And that book that I threw an image of, and somebody uplifted earlier in the chat, an Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, was really meaningful to me personally on that point, because it began to unpack how that white colonialist narrative was constructed in a way that was more specific and more and therefore more revealing to me than most other texts or podcasts or documentaries or conversations that I'd had. And so I think the more we can understand how that narrative is constructed and begin to look at the specific images and the specific stories and the specific examples of media, as we've begun to hear tonight, and to see how our experience is constructed, I think that helps us to deconstruct it. And that's something that we can all lean in on. We can all look back in our history and deconstruct that and have conversations with each other about it. As those are the conversations that I'm having in my family, and I think that that my colleagues are having, I think it does help. And you get to hear people's perspective and hear how their experience was constructed too. And that's a human conversation. You know, that's not a political, it doesn't need to be a political conversation or an ideological conversation. It's a conversation about what you are seeing and hearing, you know, as you were forming your own story of the world.
Which gets to the question, is there anything we can do to help support this work? I think that book, reading that book is one thing, but is there anything else that comes to mind and heart for you with regard to the schoolwork?
Say that one more time. I'm sorry, I got lost in that.
Is there anything we can do to help support this work is a question that someone asked. And so, you know, reading, understanding, going through our own upbringing, those are all good things. Is there anything else that comes to mind for you that we can help support your work in the schools?
I appreciate that. You know, I mean, I think in the most informal way, talking to the people that you're connected to in the schools. So if you are friendly with teachers, if you have family in the schools, you know, begin to ask what they're learning and what they're talking about, and to share, you know, to do your own learning and to share that with the people that you're in conversation with, I think is meaningful and important. Forming partnerships and forming friendships, I think on your own and in the organization, I always like for people to work in the spheres that they are connected in. So if you're a member of organizations, as I'm a member of like the Albemarle County Public Schools, that's the sphere that I try to work in. I think working in the spheres that you're a part of is significant too. I know that's not a direct impact on the schools, but sometimes it may be better to work right within your locus of control. So if you have a direct connection to the school, then certainly reach out, but also consider the opportunities to do this kind of work and have these kind of conversations in the organizations that you're part of too.
That's great, thanks. Richard says, what is the significance of tribes being federally recognized? Are the tribe residents citizens of the tribal lands and not citizens of the US? Do they forfeit the rights of US citizens have then? How does this work?
That's a great question. It's a complicated question. I won't pretend to know all of the details, but I will say that it is very significant federal recognition and is meaningful, and is something that the Virginia tribes have worked for many decades to achieve. 2018 is the year that many of the Virginia tribes received federal recognition, and it means all sorts of things. So it means funding for a lot of projects. It means official recognition and constitutional obligations and platform. And so for example, the Monacan Indian Nation, since having received federal recognition, has embarked on just a number of projects. They've, I think, are building an Indian Health Services office. They have a food bank. They've purchased a lot of land that they will continue to use and develop. I think their headquarters are expanding, and they, you know, just it's very significant. It allows for a lot. Whether that means that they're, you know, how that interacts with U.S. citizenship is a complicated question, and I won't pretend to know all of the answers to that complicated answer. Yeah.
Okay, is that something, Mike, you might want to address, or Mary?
Yeah, there was, let's see, in the late 40s, there was an act by Congress, you know, granting all tribal nations U.S. citizenship. So at this point, you know, one can be a member of a tribal nation and they are a U.S. citizen. It's not mutually exclusive.
Thank you. We're also, the center is going to put in a handout to you all about what is a state recognized tribe, what does that mean, and why is that important to Native people. So there'll be some key topics that have been worked on to help elucidate that a little more for folks. Tribal members are citizens of the U.S. and can be registered tribal members. Thank you, Michael. Bab says, it's highly offensive to me that I never hear anything about First Nations people in just about any polls or surveys, etc., of others' opinions, as though they don't even exist. If there is this significant number in Albemarle County alone, extend that to state of Virginia and extend that to the USA. It's not insignificant at all.
I think that that's a great point. I mean, that's part of what we looked at tonight. You know, our identities are erased in many ways, and when we look at demographics, you know, and so there's sometimes not that space for opinions to be considered. Although, you know, demographics and polls are not the only way that information is gathered, and I would say, tentatively hopeful about the fact that this is an issue which many people are talking about and considering, and we are hearing more voices, you know, in the media, in education, in politics, and so those voices are being heard more. But I agree that polls, surveys, demographics is an area which needs to be unpacked more, and it just doesn't impact this particular demographic either. I think it's the way we think about and consider demographics is warrants a lot of consideration.
Jim, thank you. Jim Hasmer asked, is Indigenous People Month, is that happening in public schools?
Yeah, absolutely. Much of the work that we're encouraging in our schools involves asking educators to learn about the Virginia Indian tribes, to reach out to the Virginia Indian tribes, and to plan when appropriate with them, and specifically with the Monacan Indian Nation. That's happening in a number of schools. I was pleased even today to go through and see in the hallways as student artwork was put up, the Monacan Nation appearing prominently in a way that I'm not sure that I've ever seen that happen before. So those conversations are happening. And I think that that's a start. And a lot of our educators are beginning to take the heritage months are always like, you want to be sure that people are thinking beyond just the month and not relegating their efforts to like tokenizing or just kind of focusing on a particular month. So what I'm encouraged to see is that many educators are taking this opportunity to dig into their own professional learning. The Virginia Tribal Education Consortium produced some wonderful professional development that people can go through in a self-paced way and learn about the Virginia tribes in their own words, based on their own resources. And we have a number of educators who are moving through that professional development and taking the opportunity this month and their heightened awareness in this month to engage in that professional learning. And so that's encouraging.